Thanks, Jan Roj, and thanks for this conference. Normally that's just a courtesy that you say before you start speaking, but I think in this case it's very meaningful, because if you think we're now into the third anniversary of the Syrian Revolution, and I can't think of another event of this kind, and that's to do with the myths and really the bad politics around the Syrian Revolution that's very obvious on the British left and wider, which has prevented this kind of thing from happening before. So I think it is something to be thankful for. Normally, if I was speaking about Syria, I would spend a lot of time kind of debunking those very simplistic ideas that this is simply a conspiracy of Western powers in Saudi Arabia using jihadists to overcome a socialist, or at least in some sense non-neoliberal resistance regime. But that's already been done, so it leaves me at a bit of a loss to know what to talk about. But I would add to some of the points, first of all, that have been made by Budor in particular and by Joseph earlier, about the nature of the regime and also its relationship to sectarianism. And then I'll talk a bit more about the things that we actually do hear most about in the news, which is presenting this as simply a military conflict. And I'll say that you can't understand the nature of the military conflict itself and the geopolitical machinations unless you see this as a popular revolution. So, first of all, the regime itself, an important thing to know about it is it's built for this moment. The regime was built by the father, by Hafez, in order to be counter-revolutionary, to withstand exactly the kind of movement that we've seen, very consciously. So, first of all, Hafez, for example, 3 years after his death, he was still the president of the Syrian branch of the Arab Ba'ath. Now that's leadership. I mean, that shows you the incredible desire to stay in power. Now, not only that, and this is important for any discussion of tendencies towards sectarianism that may be present, Hafez personally picked any officer in the armed forces with command over large amounts of firepower, an airplane or a tank battalion. He personally picked them. He knew their names, he knew their families. And he did that so that he would be sure when this moment came that they would control the core of the army. And that means, not for religious doctrinal reasons, or even for terms of privilege that we should ascribe to these people, that inevitably these are people who are closer to his family, closer to his region. And by and large, in that case, Alawites. Not all Alawites supporting the regime, but the regime taking Alawites hostage against the rest of the country. This is how sectarianism works. So, being in a sect, it's not... By the way, is this microphone giving feedback?
Can I just talk like that? Is that better?
You want the mic? Okay.
A little further away.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So, being in a sect is not something you are, it's something that you do. It's something that's reproduced by the politics of the country that you live in. And it's the politics of the regime that has produced this. So, if you think about it, if you are in a village where you are having bombs of air fuel dropped on you, and I don't understand why this is not a sectarian attack, and attacking somebody with a knife is a sectarian attack. If that's happening to you, and you know, almost certainly, that the pilot of that plane is an Alawite, then it's much easier to believe the really awful, bigoted, reactionary hatred that people come to give you to explain that. If the people who should be denying that stuff are going around saying, oh, you're part of a Western conspiracy to destroy the country. It's an abandonment of responsibility on the part of people who should be anti-sectarian and anti-imperialist to let that go on. So it's not surprising that you would reach, to some extent, that kind of point. So that's the first point about, if you like, the regime. Secondly, if we're going to understand the military situation and the geopolitical situation as described by Joseph in terms of the contest between these two axes, you cannot explain it unless you see this as a popular uprising. The main question here is, why hasn't the regime won, actually? Because this is an army that is about started out about 300,000 men. I mean, that's quite substantial. They're fighting against groups who are by and large without heavy armour, by and large without tanks, without heavy artillery, without any air defences at all. How is it that this can go on for so long? how is it that it can reach this essentially a stalemate, where the regime is down to relying on its foreign allies, and Assad has all of the main backers here. So the Turkish border is open to supply, if you like, the revolutionary forces. But the rest of the surrounding regional powers, Hezbollah, basically, Lebanon, Iran, and more, in fact, quite importantly, Iraq, are all on Assad's side. How is it that with these forces, he can't win? So the reason he can't win is that his forces have been whittled down. You didn't get a lot of defections of whole units, but basically people, conscripts left throughout the summer of 2011-2012. So now you have a hard core, mainly in the Air Force, which is completely loyal, mostly, to the regime. And on that basis, expanding a truly sectarian recruitment of the so-called Quwat al-Wataniya, the national forces, which are basically essentially recruited on we can say an anti-Sunni basis, or the idea of being purely for loyalty to Assad. So he's got down to the forces that he can really rely on. Okay, so he can get these guys to fight for him, but you can't rule the country on that basis. You can't actually go and govern, for example, Homs. You can't go and govern most of Aleppo. And this is why we've reached this stalemate, coming into this meeting at Geneva, Geneva 2. We can't explain how you get to that point unless you understand that most of the country doesn't want to be governed by Assad. You know, that's the basic fact of what's going on. Geneva 2, Geneva 1 was so successful, they thought, let's have a Geneva 2, you know, he's really going to go somewhere. So that's based upon essentially something I think that Joseph mentioned earlier, which is a convergence amongst these geopolitical axes of what they would like to see in Syria, with a small difference, and that's the person of Bashar. So really, when people say that this is a Western-backed rebellion, this is an imperialist-backed rebellion, my God, you've got nothing to worry about from imperialist-backed rebellions if this is an imperialist-backed rebellion, because they are not doing anything. I'm not saying that I want that to happen, but it's just simply a fact. It's simply a fact. On the other side, you have very clearly Russia and Iran pouring money and arms credits into this. And I think they know to some extent, since the Ghouta attack, that they can't do that indefinitely. And this is a reason why they're willing to, even to have negotiations when Iran isn't allowed to come. But this isn't going to go anywhere in the near term. It may result, I think, in some sort of compromise around a semi-Assadism, but that would be something quite far in the future. I think that both the US and Russia in particular are coming to see this as a state, more so the US, that they just want to manage. Their aim is to manage this, rather than in any sense to support the revolution. They want to send that backwards. So we may, I accept Jean Roger's point that when you look at the dreadful suffering, who couldn't say we want peace? You know, who couldn't say that? You want to see an end to this. But the future with Assad looks like the present, basically. So any route to a future that includes this regime, it's delaying actually something. In the future, 5, 7, 10 years, when is it okay for people to demonstrate against the Assad regime? When will they not be judged for fighting back against this militarized regime, this regime which has been militarized for 40 years? So really there's no, I don't think there is a future in that direction. But where there might be, and this is where I want to take on some of the points which were not we couldn't talk about fully earlier, is this idea that the Syrian revolutionaries do not exist has been proven quite false in the past couple of months in the struggle against the reactionaries, against Daesh, against the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. So as you will know, they've been driven out and faced the military opposition by other Islamists in some cases, so the Islamic front is also quite reactionary, but that's not the sole story here. From the whole of the northern belt of Syria, where Daesh and others, I mean, Nusra did a similar thing, but basically the Islamic State, they come in after the revolution has expelled the state forces, and they try and govern it according to their reactionary ideas. And what we see, very encouragingly, is that Syrians and Syrian revolutionaries they don't stand for that sort of nonsense, basically. And they demonstrated continually, as they did against the regime. And it was clear in their slogans when they were saying the Islamic State and the regime are one. We face two regimes. And it's because of that popular pressure, which is freely available for anybody to see, in Raqqa, in Sarakab, all across the north, that they lost their weak. It's been proven that the future of Syria does not have to be under the rule, under the heel of Islamist reactionaries, because the people who are fighting the regime have been fighting these guys as well, and in many cases succeeding. So, having taken those things on, how long have I got? Okay, I just want to talk a little bit about, I think, the origin and the spread of these, let's say, myths about the Syrian Revolution, and why they're so prevalent on the left, and the liberal left in Britain. One reason is that simply there are very few sources of information that people are willing to look to and look for. It's not that they are absent, even in English. So we have the blogs that have been mentioned before. There are many such sources. But there is something in the mainstream media that then it's an absolute disgrace that the left is willing to take this up, which is essentially a view that the Middle East, Islamic countries, are about Islamism. Everything is about crazy Muslims with beards who cut people's heads off. And this is the editor's eye view of the world, for the BBC, for the Guardian, for the Times, for the Telegraph, for everything. They took about 3 months, 6 months of the Arab revolutions to have some distancing from that, and then they went straight back to the same old narrative. Now, the job of people on the left, or critical media, is not to support that kind of narrative, it's to criticise it. But that hasn't been done. That has been completely replayed, actually, and completely supported. So if you look at any given week, the idea that there is some huge rush, as there was to war in Iraq, pushing for intervention in Syria in the Western media, not at all. Every single story that you see will be along the lines of, look at these guys eating somebody's heart, look at these guys who are crazy Islamists who are taking over the country, it's Afghanistan. What a mess. They won't report, and to be fair, in many cases they can't report on what's actually going on the ground. It is a dangerous situation. But they react to this with a lazy stereotype, which is then replayed in almost every kind of left-wing analysis that you get. This feeds into, I think, a kind of conspiratorial view of the world, which simply imagines that you will say, I'll draw back the curtain, and I'm going to show you what's really going on. I'm sorry, the people who are really doing what's going on don't know what's going on. That's kind of the truth of the world that we live in. You will not get to this heartland of the conspiracy where you know what's happening. I mean, this is going to be even worse if you get in a taxi anywhere in the Arab world where somehow this guy has a direct line to Tel Aviv and all of the plans that they have made for every single thing that's happened. But that's quite an infectious worldview, which I think has taken over on some of the British left. But finally, both in the region and in terms of the local communist parties, so Joseph mentioned that Syria was blessed with not one, but 1.4 communist parties, you know, had more than enough to go around. But one of them, its name was simply named after the leader, Bagdash. So it shows you the kind of politics involved, where the name is just the guy who runs it. So this has, both in the Arab communist parties, the Arab left, and in the European, but especially the British left, there is a kind of legacy of what let's broadly call Stalinism, but the idea that social change, that politics, as Miriam mentioned before, is something that is conducted by people at the top. It's something that is done by the people, the elites. And you look at what they do, what they might think, you look at their interactions as states or not, in terms of their geopolitics, and that is what politics is about. And that the only thing you can ever hope to do is to support one group of those elites against another group that you perceive to be worse. And that, I think, is at the heart of the way people react to this. They won't stake their politics on the Syrians, on the Syrian people. And that indicates something really sad, which is a lack of belief in human emancipation. I think, however, I mean, especially when we heard this morning's story from Eva about people literally driven back to the Stone Age, right? I mean, living in a museum of cave life. So if you have a regime that is prepared to drive people back to the Stone Age, what are you going to do? Do you really have the right to judge how people react to that regime? If you're in that situation, and yet still we see the Syrians are managing their own lives, they are organising collectively, they are still maintaining a belief in their revolution, they believe in human emancipation. They teach us about it, and I hope that when we have, if we have the British Revolution, and it's complicated and messy and horrible and weird, I mean, God, look at the British left now, let alone in the future. If that happens, I would hope that the Syrians don't judge us as harshly as they have been judged.